Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you today?
Good, Andrew. It's still. I told myself I wasn't going to talk about the weather, but it is cold and rainy in Krakow. So I'm so looking forward to next week because it's going to get a little bit warmer, and we're going to have a couple days off because I think it's Constitution Day on May 3rd. So my wife and I, we might go up to Wrocław, former Breslau.
Oh yeah.
So, anyways, I'm super excited about that because I looked up like the family name and it says it comes from Breslau. So maybe I'll.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe Dietrich Bonhoeffer is from Breslau. So I don't know why he's on my mind, but anyway.
Well,
all right. He's someone actually who intersects sort of, maybe a little bit, with the person we're going to talk about today, namely Pope Benedict XVI. And the person we're talking to about Pope Benedict XVI is our old friend and colleague, Richard DeClue. We've had a chance to meet a lot of new friends along the way so far in our short life as an institute and as a podcast, but we're really delighted to get to reconnect with our old friend, Richard, today. So, Richard, how are you?
I'm great. It's good to talk to you guys again.
Yeah, great to see you. And we are really happy for you because you have published a wonderful new book that we're going to talk to you about today. We remember when you were writing it, and we were excited for you as it was coming together. And we're really, really happy for you now that it has seen the light of day. And the book is called The Mind of Benedict XVI. Let me read the subtitle. The subtitle is A Theology of Communion. Now, we were talking just before we started recording that, Bobby and I both agree, not just because we're your friend, but also because we are very interested in the person of Benedict XVI and his work, that we both agree that this is a great book to just put in the hands of somebody who wants to know more about Benedict XVI. So tell us, what was going on as you were writing this book? What was your goal?
Yeah, well, as I do that, let me just, for those who are watching on video, I'll show you the cover here, just so they can kind of get
very
a sense
handsome.
of what it looks like. Yeah. So basically, the idea I had in writing this book was the fact that I had learned so much from my studies of Ratzinger over the years. And it was primarily through studying his works that I began to see in a more clear way the cohesiveness of the Catholic faith, and how the various doctrines of the faith are not really just a bunch of separate questions that you can understand in isolation, but are really more of an interconnected web of meaning that all fit together in some way. And so what I wanted to try to do was not just treat random topics, and because there's a lot of good books on Ratzinger already out there, and they had, they're good for what they are, and I'm not detracting from them at all. They had a different goal than I did. So mine was primarily to try to show those interconnections. So to highlight how is it that Trinitarian theology impacts your understanding of every other topic in dogmatic and systematic theology, and even moral theology and liturgy. How does the Eucharist relate to Christology and soteriology? And so that was really my goal, was to try to show the unity of Benedict's thoughts. So sort of taking the puzzle pieces that he provided us and then showing how they fit together and form one picture. So that basically was the idea, was to provide an overview to the reader to get a good grasp of the big picture. And then, of course, there's always more details you can go into, which you might find in some other books and in his own writings.
Yeah, and maybe if I could just follow up. I mean, some people may remark about Pope Benedict, right, that he wasn't a systematic theologian in the same way that, maybe some other prominent figures of the 20th century were. And one of the reasons might be because he was like a full-time churchman, right? Among other reasons. But what you do in your book, I love how you're looking for as you said, the unifying theme, like basically sort of, what is Pope Benedict any less a systematic theologian than St. Augustine was, for example, right? We admire that, actually, at least I do when I read theology, that there's It's coming from a lot of different places, but it is all held together. So I don't know if you have any comments about that, but I just thought that really stood out at the beginning of your book.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things about him that is so unique, most academic theologians specialize and subspecialize. So obviously he was a dogmatic and fundamental theologian by training. That was his formal degrees and professorships were in fundamental and dogmatic theology, which you could call systematic theology, put those together. But even within that, most will focus like, well, this professor's the ecclesiology guy. This guy's the Christology guy. Even like if you look at scripture scholarship, right? It's like, well, this person focuses on Pauline literature. This person does, wisdom literature. And, there's specialties within specialties. Or, well, this person does moral theology. That person does sacramental theology, and they're kept separate. And what's amazing about him is the fact that he wrote on pretty much every major area of theology you can think of. He did all of that, even straying in some ways away from strict fundamental and dogmatic theology. Like when he enters in and writes a couple books on the liturgy. That's not technically his field, and yet he approaches it in a way. And the way he's able to integrate, which I think is actually the proper way of doing dogmatic theology, is the way he's able to integrate biblical scholarship into his dogmatic theology. So in a way, he doesn't forego the preliminary steps of doing positive theology, of digging through the sources of scripture and tradition and the fathers beforehand. Like he does a lot of that before he does his own systematic treatise. So the fact that he wrote on all of those things so that we could, combine, like I couldn't do this book if he wasn't so broad in what he worked on, which is just remarkable. It's not something you see that often.
Richard, as you're talking, I was thinking, and that and Andrew, you mentioned him being a churchman primarily. And it made me think of a comment that Robert Spemann, who was a good friend of Pope Benedict's, Robert Spemann, the famous late German philosopher, he had this comment that he never really got around to writing his great kind of, if you want to call it, like great philosophical magnum opus, because he always had to deal with an issue at hand. There was always something that he felt compelled he had to address. And so finally, it was near like the late of his life, his wife asked him, "Are you finally going to get around to writing this book?" And I'm not sure if he ever did, but it made me think of Pope Benedict, because, even the Jesus of Nazareth trilogy, I mean, it was just at the service of saying, hey, we have to rediscover the face of Christ, the face of God. And then you think even at the beginning of Introduction to Christianity, I mean, it's in response to like the situation of 1968. So, I mean, Richard, though, like, what would you say, though? I mean, like at the heart, I took a look at your book, and it is really, really a great summary, and you get at the heart of what he's about. But could you articulate what is, say, Pope Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, what's the heart of his theology? Where would you say like is the core of everything for him?
Well, as the subtitle indicates, communion. Now, that I use communion as the leitmotif, but I emphasize the fact that it's rooted in the Trinity. So as proper theology, a word about God, everything in theology somehow relates back to God as its origin, its end. And so it's the communion of the three divine persons as one God that is sort of the core of his theology, in my opinion. And then the center of that is Christ. So you have sort of like a Trinitarian foundation and a Christocentrism united together. And so basically this notion of uniting, it's the unity while maintaining the distinctions, because for him, it's not a unity that destroys the individuality, right? It doesn't, like our union, the union of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit doesn't, dissolve their identity as persons, that, the Father is not the Son, it's their unity in relation. And the same thing is true throughout his theology. It's this, which is contrary to some, Eastern mysticisms, which actually think that, their goal is to be dissolved into the one where there's no distinction whatsoever. And part of Ratzinger's thing is like, no, it's the beauty of it is precisely this unity in distinction. And so I tried to show how that theme is really what binds all the different pieces together, even in things like moral theology or liturgy, and especially eschatology, of course. And well, ecclesiology is probably where it's like the most obvious. But that to me, I think is the heart of it. It's that notion of communion rooted in the Trinity, centered on Christ.
And with the ecclesiology stuff, I mean, could you say, I mean, for many of our listeners, maybe they are not really familiar with his academic work, but you mentioned the communio and his communio Eucharistic ecclesiology. Could you say maybe a little bit how maybe his dissertation, habilitation work maybe was lending itself to those addressing questions around ecclesiology later on?
Yeah, so his first big work, you could say, was his doctoral dissertation, which was on the house and people of God in St. Augustine's Doctrine on the Church. So it was in ecclesiology using, a great Western Church father. And that helped him, form some foundations for his ecclesiology. But then he was also highly impacted by the work of Henri de Lubac and his book Corpus Mysticum, which showed the connection between the Eucharist and the Church, which de Lubac had felt we'd sort of had lost a good sense of that. It was in our tradition, but it wasn't in the contemporary consciousness. So he helped. Ratzinger credits de Lubac with helping to repopularize this sort of forgotten truth of our faith, which is that it's not just that the Church makes the Eucharist, but rather that the Eucharist makes the Church. It's through the reception of the body of Christ that we become the body of Christ. And that you have to have Eucharistic realism and ecclesial realism go together. Like, you don't have ecclesial realism without Eucharistic realism. And so the idea of the fact that, going back to 1 Corinthians 10, right, it's we are one body because we all partake of the one loaf. It's our participation in the Eucharist is the foundation of our communion with one another. So his ecclesiology is very Eucharistic in that sense, as he sees the Eucharist as, in some sense, the causal agent that brings forth the Church, which, of course, because what is the Church? It's the union of the members of the body of Christ with Christ, right? And where does that take place? Well, preeminently through the apex of that is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. So now, and then, of course, he'll go into how the structure of the Church is related to that, and how the hierarchical constitution of the Church serves this unity, because it's not an egalitarianism. It is like a body. It has a hierarchical ordering that makes it function properly. And so that's a big part of his ecclesiology too, is again, it's the unity in relation, which means you don't, the finger doesn't become the eye, which doesn't become the ear, that it's precisely in the symphony of the parts that the whole is manifest. And so, but again, it's, all of that's linked together, right? Because the Church is the mystery of unity with Christ. So your sacramental theology informs your ecclesiology, which is rooted in Christology, which then links you back to the Trinity, right? It's union with Christ gives us union with the Trinity. So it's all, again, you kind of see all those elements come together.
You brought up Henri de Lubac, and maybe we'll stick with him just for a moment, because I know you say right at the beginning of the book in several places that he was so influential on Ratzinger. And I love the Catholicism book very, very much by de Lubac. And one of the things that completely changed the way that I think about the church, reading that book, was thinking of the church as reality. Therefore there's this movie Bobby and I talk about sometimes, or I talk about it, I've written about it, this movie called St. Vincent, where there's a theology teacher played by Chris O'Dowd, and he's a priest. And he says to his class, "We believe Catholicism is the best religion because we have the most rules," which is precisely not true, right? I mean, the rules are all important, right? But they're all descriptive of reality. And so I don't know, just thought maybe that's something that I hope people are going to really appreciate about Pope Benedict's thinking about the church in the decades and the centuries to come, that we really need to be thinking of the church in that light. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And like you, that book, Catholicism, was very impactful on Ratzinger. He was, I believe, was Alfred Lepla gave it to him in the translation done by Hans-Urs von Balthasar from French into German. And when Ratzinger was still a student, I believe in the 40s. And he says that book, Catholicism, really helped change his understanding of theology in general. Like, it really impacted the way he even understood theology and understood the faith. So it was a tremendous impact on him. And I think you're right. The theme of reality is so important. And this is something that I think is becoming more and more necessary to understand, is, harkening back to another theme in de Lubac, but the idea that, there is no purely natural utopia. Like, the metaphysical realities. So if you want to get in even to the philosophy of it, we need grace and we need revelation to be fully human. Gaudium et Spes 22, right? Like, Jesus reveals to us what it truly means to be human. And we can't just, for the sake of some sort of ideological purity, bracket that off intentionally when we know it's true. I recently was asked a question, and I won't go into, the whole format for where it came through, but one of the things I said was, if philosophy is the love of wisdom, then why on earth would you intentionally ignore the highest source of wisdom you could possibly have on this earth?
Yeah.
Because that seems to me you're not really loving wisdom. You're loving your natural powers of intellect to see. It's like you want to do a puzzle and see how well you can score on the IQ test of philosophical inquiry, when instead of, because you're like, well, I don't want to cheat. I want to solve the puzzle on my own, right? I'm going to bracket off revelation. I'm going to bracket off faith, because I want to maintain the purity of the exercise. Well, what good is that? Like, in some sense, God didn't reveal himself so that we could ignore him, and the reality of it is full human flourishing is only going to happen through the reception of God and his will for us.
This is Andrew. It's funny that you bring this up in these terms. Andrew and I were talking about this a little earlier today about, like, de Lubac's service to the church in bringing that out, as like Andrew, you said, it's reality, and we find the fullness of the Gaudium et Spes 22 quote, which I think is almost verbatim from Catholicism, or maybe it's the drama of Christian or atheistic humanism, but this leading, like, philosophy making its way to the temple and finding it, and just in some ways readying itself for the revelation, is so Platonic. I was reading the Phaedrus the other day, and it ends with the fame, after the whole critique of writing and all that, but it ends with this with Socrates outside the city with Phaedrus, and he just wants to, like, listening to the crickets, but sing songs, but the songs are songs of praise. And so it just, philosophy ends up inevitably, like naturally, finding its fulfillment in something like liturgy. And it just, can you maybe bring this out, Richard, a little bit more? Because, throughout Ratzinger's career, even like one of his most famous addresses, the Regensburg Address, it's almost as if, let's stop dividing faith and reason. Let's stop dividing philosophy, theology. Yes, there should be a distinction, but the two inevitably, like you say, in relation, amplify each other. So can you maybe say, and also about the Platonic stuff? I mean, because Plato, as you write in your book, rightly needs to be, in a way, how do I say it? Maybe like purified by Christianity, but yet it's almost like Plato's like, please do that. Please purify me, like lead me further. And that's why it's like his other great love, St. Augustine, in some ways, just saw it going there.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a lot of points that are very central to Ratzinger's own understanding and views. One thing to start, you're right. A lot of what he does is he tries to avoid false dichotomies, and he's seeing the perpetual danger of emphasizing one half of a truth at the exclusion of another. So, and that often happens due to allergic reactions based on real fallacies and heresies that have happened in the past, right? So, as an example, with modernism, you had this sort of turn to the subject in a sense of this hyper relativization of everything, right? It's all about the individual and the individual person detached from others in a way. And theology becomes more about sentiment that wells up from within. It's not as objective. It's not about what we're receiving from outside, but sort of our internal mystical experiences, right? And, with the Protestant Reformation, sort of a rejection of this authority and the objectivity of certain things. Well, then what happens in reaction to that in the post-Tridentine period is you end up having an emphasis on, no, truth is ahistorical, it's transcendent, it's unchanging, it's stable. And then, but that led to sort of an allergic reaction to using terms that sounded like anything from modernism. So then the idea of person, the idea of subject, you hear that word in that context and you think modernism, right? It's sort of like post-Hegel, you can't say history without people going, suspecting you of modernism. And it's like, and he's like, whoa. You can't let the heretics and the erroneous philosophers and theologians like carve out for themselves entire aspects of reality and keep it for themselves. You can't, and therefore run to the other side. It's not metaphysics or history. It's both. It's not subject or object. It's both. It's not individual or communal. It's the conflation. It's the uniting of the two, and so he's constantly trying to, one of his arguments in his Habilitationsschrift, his original, second dissertation, if you will, was that a lot of post-Tridentine theology became more counter-reformational than Catholic, because it was avoiding aspects of the Catholic tradition precisely to avoid sounding modernist or Protestant. And his point is like, no, we need to retrieve in a proper Catholic way the notions of subjectivity and the notions of history and wrest it from the false philosophies, and let's show a Catholic vision of these things. And let's not just abandon those concepts. We don't have to give up objectivity just because we also affirm subjectivity. Like, there's a way of uniting the two. So I think you're absolutely right on that, is like keeping the unity in the distinctions, and not throwing out one aspect of the faith for another, was highly central. And there was something else you said that and I've forgotten who it was now. But yeah, I mean
Maybe Richard, I was, you have a comment in there about his interest around the same time as maybe he's reading de Lubac, taking an interest in the liturgical movement. And so like maybe, you also mentioned his like little like how do I say hesitant appreciation for it. But maybe could you say like a few words about like the centrality too of or the importance of the liturgy for Pope Benedict? Because I love in the beginning when you actually you give like I think one of the best introductions to his childhood and his development, and that he actually asked the Christ child for a missal, and that like going and partaking in the liturgy from a young age was so important to him. And it just seems like he is in his service to the church, everything is for the sake of better participation in the liturgy. So maybe, I mean, like I bring up the Phaedrus stuff because oftentimes I just love it that inevitably you have this idea that Socrates at the end of the day, all he wants to do really is sing divine praise. I think even at the end of his life, he wants to sing songs. And I kind of, after, when you study so much philosophy, you sometimes are like, my gosh, maybe I should just shut up and do something else. Or hopefully these other guys should just do that too. But it seems like maybe Socrates is onto something by just, let's stop talking about the world and things so much, but just sing songs in gratitude for it.
Yeah, I mean, the young Joseph Ratzinger was a pious Bavarian child before he was an intellectual academic. And the beauty is he never lost that. And that's why, I started the book with, there's tons of information on his biography already, right? There's already, you've got his own memoirs that go up to 1977. You've got the 2 volumes of the Sebald. You've got the other books of interviews with Sebald. You've got his brother Georg's writings about his brother. There's tons of biographical information out there, but I still wanted to write a chapter from the very beginning talking about his life, because I think if you understand his early years, you will see how and why his later theology was so important to him. So how these you kind of get glimpses or foreshadowings of his later works by looking through his biography. So I try to show you thematically, like, look, this theme, this is where it comes up in his childhood. This is where this became important. And the liturgy was one of the earliest things that impacted his life. The fact that as a child, like he has these memories of just being enraptured by the liturgy and the beauty of it and the heavenly nature of it, where the sunbeam shining through the clouds of incense and the beauty of the music and all these things sort of cohering, where it was the angelic sounds coming from the scola. These things, he says, it helped him realize that this wasn't simply something man-made that we had just created, but rather had a higher source. And so it was the beauty of the liturgy that really helped him see the truth of the faith, and from a very young age, and it's that via pulchritudinis, right? It's like how beauty leads us to a perception of the true reality. And I think all of that was huge for him because, when he was in his theological studies, the liturgical movement was going on, and he was somewhat leery of it at first. And, I'm not a liturgical theologian, but there were aspects of it that he was very leery of. And he was, concern like, oh, they want to sort of reconstruct some liturgy from the past that maybe even didn't exist, or they only see one form of the liturgy as valid. Oh, isn't that prescient? So he did have concerns, and I might be putting some words in his mouth a little bit, but maybe over archaeologizing things, like, oh, well, we found this old thing, let's throw it back in. Like he had some concerns about it, but he was sort of convinced by one of his professors that it was worth, it had some value. So he kind of went along with it and was like, okay, there's good in here. Okay, he kind of convinced me to, not reject it outright, and to kind of see value in it. Well, then, the actual liturgical reforms take place in, 69, 70. And he's like, darn it, like this is exactly what I was worried about from the beginning. Like all of the worst elements of the liturgical movement I was concerned about beforehand ended up coming back in full force, and now it seems like we do have a liturgy that was sort of created wholesale and that was made by man and sort of, artificially, disassembled the liturgy we had and then like recreated a new version, wholesale rather than, slowly, pruning what we had. And he just thought that that was inappropriate. And more than that, he thought it was inappropriate because he said there was no precedence of this in tradition at all, to literally abrogate liturgies that were older than 200 years. Before, even with Trent, it was like any liturgy that was older than 200 years old could still be celebrated. And so the idea that, no, we're going to throw out everything from the past and now only do this in a very newly constructed way, that really rubbed him the wrong way. He did not appreciate the actual, and he didn't think it's at all what Vatican II called for. So now he's an interesting figure because he will also defend the new missal. Like there are places where he defends it, especially against, radical traditionalists. But he does still have like real strong concerns over the way it was done and how it was completely segregated from its own liturgical history and development, and how the old was now almost vilified as if somehow it was, he says, well, that which was considered holy and sacred for all those centuries cannot now all of a sudden be seen to be unholy, and so this sort of loathing for the traditional liturgy he thought was very inappropriate. Though he did think there were reasons to reform it. So he was pro-reform of that. He didn't think it was perfect and that it couldn't use some pruning itself. But this wholesale rejection of that he thought was not good. And in some sense, I think it was very hard on him because that the liturgy was what for him from the beginning was so impactful in his own faith. It's really what, the piety of the Bavarian farmers that he was around was helpful too, and his parents, and going on Marian pilgrimages, and going to the Ponlock Chapel, and all of those liturgical elements were huge to his formation. And because he had a great appreciation for good music, that's why I think if you read like Spirit of the Liturgy, his emphasis on what's appropriate music and what isn't is very strong. And I think probably the debasing of liturgical music was probably one of the hardest things for him to take, because he loves the liturgy, and even independently, he's a huge fan of Mozart and good music. And for him to have music that doesn't fit the sacred actions taking place is just unacceptable, and this idea of just importing popular music into the liturgy, like he didn't have much patience for that at all. And again, I think all of those you can find rooted in his childhood. Like, you're destroying this thing that really is what drew me into the faith, and I wouldn't even be where I am without it. And, I think that's something that really was a cross for him.
Yeah, maybe we can tie. I wanted to figure out a way to do this. I want to keep going with the liturgy thing, but I also want to talk about Ratzinger Benedict as a European man, because in a sense, that's a very important thing for us in our Spe Salvi Institute. We're very interested in kind of the faith and Europe. Something that occurs to me, as you say, very clearly in the book, you already basically explained this, but it's so important to understand Ratzinger's formation as a child in this deeply Catholic culture. And in fact, the culture was so Catholic that it held out a lot longer against the Nazis, right? I mean, it had this strong resistance to a kind of alien, worldly force, right? That they attempted to kind of put upon it. Now, maybe critics of Benedict would say, well, he was so, just so European that of course he would only say we should listen to Mozart in church, and everybody knows you can have all kinds of wonderful expressions of music and et cetera, right? But we really want to focus on the fact that there is something to the idea that Europe and the faith are inextricably linked. There's just no way around that. And in the person of Benedict XVI, we really see how that plays out to some degree. I mean, he was very interested, right, when the Berlin Wall fell. He was very interested in what Europe would become in this new reality and like what that would mean for any possibility, maybe one day, of a kind of renewed Christian society, right? So maybe I'll just throw it back to you and just ask you to run with the ball.
Yeah, I mean, those are great points. And there's actually so many points that you can bring in together into conversation on this. So to start with the European culture thing, which relates back to the liturgy and his concerns over it. For one thing, he does have a providential view of history. So for instance, he doesn't think that the church was formed in sort of an environment that allowed for a conversation between Judaism and Greek philosophy. He doesn't think that's accidental. He doesn't think Plato and Aristotle are, some sort of accidents of history that happen to be at hand to be borrowed by the church fathers and the scholastics. Like, he thinks it was like there's divine providence involved in these things. And so in talking about like bringing this, he very much is, he sees Europe, I think, as an example when it was at its height or when it's at its best as what the faith can do to a culture. It's not pagan European culture that he's talking about. It's Christianized Europe. And that's why one of his big concerns, like he's got books where he talks about this, right? Is, if Europe ignores its roots in Christianity, it will lose itself. You can't divorce authentic European culture from its Catholic Christian roots. It will not be what it was. It will dissipate. Well, the same thing is true with, this idea that, oh, well, that's just Western music. His whole point is like, no, it's not just Western music. It was music created by an already purified Christian culture that then produced music specifically made for the liturgy. And that's why it's the most appropriate for the liturgy, right? Especially if we're talking about the Latin Rite, right? It's the Latin Rite. It's not, what's appropriate for that is its own culture. And the idea for him is like, yes, you can have enculturation, but that has to take place over centuries. You don't just start importing whatever's at hand from a culture into the liturgy right away. You have to purify. He says that's what happened in Europe. Like the great liturgical music of the centuries that came out of Europe were the result of that long process. And that music was made specifically for the liturgy. It wasn't something made for pop culture that they then got imported artificially into the liturgy. And so that's his whole thing, was like, no, this is, I mean, one of his statements is that, the two things that really serve as the most strong apologetic for the Catholic faith are its saints and its art, which includes liturgical music and the paintings and the architecture, like the beauty of those things, those and the saints are really the strongest apologetic for the truth of our faith. And when you don't take true architecture, like, and music and art that is Christian in its core, like this stuff was Christian, it was Catholic in its creation. It wasn't artificially tacked on. And so his whole thing is you have to Christianize the culture before you can properly take the remaining element, which he does think, yes, there are elements of the cultures that we can maintain. We don't just wipe the culture out completely. But you purify it first. And then that culture will produce specifically Christian music out of its own roots in a way that's specifically for the liturgy. But you don't just take whatever is popular in that culture already before it was evangelized and then import it in. Like, then you're creating a disjuncture between, that's not proper enculturation.
Mm-hmm.
In some sense, that culture needs to be brought into the faith, let that faith purify it, and then that culture will remain like a distinct culture, but it will be a Christianized version of that culture, a purified version of that culture that can then produce great liturgical music and art and architecture.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just take whatever's there first and then just plug it in. It doesn't work that way.
And it seems, he gave a great address when he was Pope in Paris to, I forget the name of the exact organization that hosted his talk. Remy Bragg, by the way, I think was there. But it was at the College of like Saint Bernard or something like that. But he talks about culture. But the whole time, I don't think he really talks much about culture at all. He talks about the search for God, and he talked about monks the entire time. And, and then he relates that, though, ultimately to culture, because it seems, and so many times we hear like, okay, hey, we need to save the culture, or we need to do this with the Catholic culture. And, it just seems to me for somebody like Benedict, it's like, actually, that stuff is secondary to the primary thing of just seek the face of God, love him with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. And then all of a sudden, all that stuff will follow. Like, why would you actually make great art? Like, to go then, like I don't know, a couple of those modern artists and postmodern artists today to like, mock something or to get like millions of dollars. No, I mean, like any true artist would make it just for the sake, because it's beautiful, and I'm drawn to this. And it just seems that, like, for Benedict, I mean, like you said, even being a saint, by the way, you hear like people say, I sometimes don't like this quote, but like, you hear, who was it Bloy who said the greatest tragedy in life is not to be a saint. But I agree with that. But at the same time, you have people who are saying, well, I got to be a saint. I got to be a saint. I got to be a saint. And then they're thinking about their legacy or something and all that. But then the whole time they're missing, well, hey, no, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your strength, and all your soul. And then don't forget about the saint stuff. But it just seems to me that, like, for Benedict, it's like Europe became Europe because of those things. It was just like you said, it was the gospel, and then partaking in the liturgy opened by Christ and his church.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, it's the process, I guess you could say, is analogous to how Christ incorporates us into himself. Where we don't lose our identities and our histories and our individual personality, but we're purified and we're made whole and we're made the best version of ourselves. So a culture that's absorbed into Christ will become a better version of itself. And that's something that I think when it comes to the issues of culture that Benedict was very serious about is we can't, I think in our own day and age, we have, well, one, we're sort of, we say contradictory things all the time. Like the principle of non-contradiction seems to be not even be a thing in our society right now. But this, like we sort of, to be nice, we want to say, well, all cultures are equally valid and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's, the reality of it is all cultures have goods and all cultures have weaknesses. And, all cultures need to be purified. They're not just perfect as they are. And this is something that for Ratzinger that was important. And one of his criticisms against Rahner was this, this emphasis on, being real Christians, really accepting you as you are. Like, well, no, it's about becoming that which you're meant to be. Like you're in an unfinished state, and we're on a path of purification and progress towards greater holiness. And that's as true for cultures as it is for individuals, and so it does require this pruning and, smoothing out the edges and getting rid of things that are not compatible with the gospel, but, and living that whole, as you were saying, what does it mean to be a saint? Well, it means to be living according to the gospel in your state and life here and now. Like, be the best butcher in the city, or, be the best carpenter, be the best plumber, like be fair in your business dealings. Don't try to, don't try to fool someone into a bad deal that makes you a lot of money and screws them over when you know better. Like, be a good businessman, be an honest person, be a good neighbor, be a good husband or father, or, sibling, or, like carry out the roles in your life, in your relationships, right? It's about relation. And that's how you become a saint, is doing well and acting in a Christian way in all these different aspects of your life. It's not something else. It's not like being a saint is something you do, transcended or prescinded or abstracted from the concrete. It's precisely in the incarnational aspect of being Christic in your dealings with the world around you.
Yeah. This reminds me, Richard, I really wanted to touch on eschatology before we ran out of time, because, I think here too, we find there's this caricature of the message of salvation that you hear both on the Protestant side and on the Catholic side, which is just this sort of die and go to heaven thing, rather than living as Eucharistic man now, in the church as a Christified human, essentially experiencing eternity now in the hope of more to come, right? We named our institute the Spe Salvi Institute because we really, really think that getting eschatology wrong has been a huge problem in the church and in society. So I don't know, maybe just throw it back to you on that question and how it relates to kind of the legacy of Benedict.
Yeah, if you can look at, final causality is an important part of metaphysics, right? And Benedict was very insistent on the need for metaphysics, both in philosophy and in theology and in their mutual relation. Eschatology is important because it shows you that which we're aiming for. So in a certain sense, the goal, again, this notion of communion, right? The goal is to become a member of the communion of saints, which again, it's not just individualistic. It's not just me, like he in DeLubach reject this. It's just not just about the salvation of the individual. Yes, of course, we are judged individually, right? Okay, got it. But if heaven is a share in divine life, and divine life is the loving communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, divine life is communal, is not individualistic. And so, at the very end of his eschatology book, he makes this point. He's like, in some sense, and he's very explicit, he's not negating the role of the union with God that's at play here. It's that the vertical union with God is what makes the rest of it possible. But he says, in light of that, in some sense, The saints aren't just in heaven alongside of one another. They are heaven for one another. Like, it's being a saint in heaven, being saved is communal. It's the communion of saints we proclaim in the creed, right? Because that communal aspect is what reflects the Trinity. Like, it's our union with one another in God that manifests our union with the Trinity. Well, if that's the goal, then that's what we're supposed to asymptotically try to approach here on earth. To live an eschatological life means to try to live in perfect communion with God and neighbor here on earth. Wow, what a new concept. Jesus' twofold commands of love God and love neighbor, right? Well, what does it mean to anticipate the eschaton now? To live a life of communal holiness, to live in right relationship to God and in right relationship to those around you, and for the love of God, right? That's where the theological virtue comes in. But yeah, so.
Right, not just biding our time, keeping the rules, and looking forward to our individualized experience of the beatific vision. Like, maybe there's somebody next to us like, oh, hey, how's the beatific vision for you? Oh, it's good. How's it going for you? Good. Yeah. And then you get back to your, individual experience, right?
What's that DeClue line with like holding the rose by yourself, walking through the battlefield of life or something in the beginning of Catholicism? Doesn't he mention this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't remember the exact quote, but yeah, that rings a bell. Yeah, it's not just about ourselves as individuals, and that's true in so many levels, we could talk for hours just on that theme alone. But yeah, it's about, if you want to be a saint in eternity, you have to start being a saint now. And what it means being communal, it means being in communion with God through prayer and devotion, and living the virtues and the beatitudes, and living in right relationship in both justice and charity to those around you. I mean, that's what it means, so
in Spe Salvi, Pope Benedict it seems to me he teams up metaphysics and history, and then he does this great analysis of modernity. So maybe could you say a little bit about that? And because I'm teaching right now history, and you're not finding much of that metaphysics and history being teamed up, but it's there implicitly. And I don't know if the school knows this, but I try to make it a little bit explicit. But it's something that students, you feel like they're drawn to, that they're interested in the Communist Manifesto, because I think it is actually like going there to like the ultimate things, but yet they don't have much other than the ideologies that Benedict critiques doing something like that.
Right. Yeah. And this shows up even in his both versions of his Habilitationsschrift, both the unapproved version and the approved version, with his Theology of History of St. Bonaventure, right? Where he explicitly says, trying to wed metaphysics and history. And I think he does so, the best way to explain it is through the medieval notion of the exitus reditus, which of course has its, precursors in, I think, Pseudo-Dionysius. I could be wrong about that. But the notion of all things come from God and then return back to God. So, right, he sees history as this process of proceeding from God in creation and then returning back to God in salvation. And so the creation, that sort of completes the circle. And he sees Christ as the center because he's the turning point. He's both the apex of the exitus and the beginning of the reditus, of the return. So it's sort of like salvation history is building up to Christ, who then inaugurates the beginning of the return aspect of it. So, in some sense, history is unfolding this metaphysical dynamic, right? I mean, where does creation exist? We're talking about metaphysics. Horses don't exist. They live in history. Humans live in history. Salvation takes place in history. But we are metaphysical, right? I mean, you can't divorce the two from each other. Without metaphysical entities, there would be no history to talk about. But without history, there would be no process of coming forth from God and returning back to him. So it's like you need both, and it's sort of nonsensical to try to divorce them from each other. It's the salvation of man takes place in history. That's where God reveals himself, in history. But it's a metaphysical reality that's taking place. The incarnation is metaphysical. It really saves us. The sanctifying grace really does metaphysically transform us, even though we receive it in historical moments through concrete sacraments that are only accessible in history, right? So it's that understanding, that seeing that they're not opposed realities. They're sort of like mutually illuminating and mutually conditioning things. In some sense, you couldn't have creation without history. And you can't have history without ontologically created creatures. So, that's part of, what it means to be finite is, this mix of the historical and metaphysical is sort of intrinsic to creatureliness in a way.
Yeah. Let's end with this, Richard. Where do you think things are going with Ratzinger's studies now? He's been dead about a year and a half. I think we all three agree that we want to promote his work. We want the world to continue to be blessed, maybe more than it ever has been in the decades and centuries to come, by the work of this great man. Where do you think things are headed?
Well, I'm hoping that his interest in his thought will continue to grow and proliferate. I do think, though, that I do hope that we can also follow his own example in doing theology. I don't think he would want there to be a strict Ratzingerian school that would imitate what he criticized about, in some sense, the commonsorial tradition. I don't think he would see himself as the end-all, be-all of all theology. I think he would see himself as, yes, an important voice that he would want to be heard. But like Aquinas, I think he would think, no, like, follow my example more than just repeat what I said. Like, yes, there's a lot we can learn from him, and we should. And that's why I wrote the book, and I want people to read him. But for me, and this is maybe a challenge to myself of where do I go now, right? It's, okay, now that I've understood what he did, I need to go do that myself, which means I need to go back and read the fathers and engage with the scriptures and go through the scholastics and do that hard work myself, and not just say, well, he did it for me, right? Because that's what some people in some of the scholastic schools did, right? Well, we don't need to do that. It was done for us. We don't need to, and that is obviously, it's a caricature in some sense, but I've seen scholastics admit it, that they're not always good at the positive theology. But so as a communio-minded Ratzingerian with, sympathies for some scholastics, I would challenge myself to actually do what he did and not just repeat what he said. And that is going back to the sources themselves and steeping myself in the tradition directly and not just through him.
That's great stuff, Richard. Our guest today has been Richard DeClue, whose new book is called The Mind of Benedict XVI, A Theology of Communion. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was great to catch up with you guys again.
It sure was. And to all of our listeners and viewers, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. If you did, please do be sure to rate us, share us, review us, all that good stuff. And then also check out our website, spacealbeinstitute.com, so you don't miss anything new. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.